I went on a trip to the wilderness area of the Black Forest, which is like a designated wilderness area that lies between the Harz and Alpine state parks. As the name suggests, it's one of the wilder and more remote areas of natural beauty in the Baden-Württemberg region. You have to drive to a small town called Hirschberg, and then turn off onto a small side road until the road ends and the hiking trail begins. I told myself that this was right, but I also knew that inviting her to go hiking was a great way to meet a very pretty girl who obviously had a passion for the outdoors. So I did that and asked her if she wanted to join me. There was a moment of hesitation on her part. She didn't seem like the kind of girl who would just go hiking down a remote forest trail with a total stranger, and for a moment I thought she was going to politely turn me down. But then there was a spark of spontaneity in her eyes before she looked at me with a wide smile and said, "Of course." She introduced herself as Paula, and as we walked, I explained that I was planning on camping somewhere for the whole weekend, but I'd be happy to drive her back to her car whenever she was ready to leave. She thanked me, said that was sweet of me to offer, and then started breaking the ice with some small talk. Then, as we felt more comfortable with each other, I can confidently say that it was one of the best first dates I've been on. It definitely had that kind of vibe. I'm no Disney prince or anything, but I don't look terrible, and I know when a girl is flirting with me and isn't just being polite or nice or anything like that. So as we were walking and talking, I was starting to get pretty excited about where this could lead. It had been a while since I tried dating anyone, and my brief foray into it was a total bust. I always found it much more attractive to meet someone naturally, rather than using the internet to force it. But as many of you will agree, that's much easier said than done. Since there was a mutual interest, we initially talked a lot about hiking, places we'd been, embarrassing situations we'd been in, and things like that. But as time went on, we also started talking about other things like our jobs, our families, and relationships. She told me that she'd been single for a while, but she wasn't looking, but she quickly added that she'd be open to changing her mind if something suitable came along. It seemed like a loaded statement, but it was very welcome. And as we walked on, I found myself wondering if this random encounter with her was the start of a lifelong romance. Looking back now, I'm actually embarrassed at how naive that sounds, but I guess loneliness is a very powerful thing. Maybe an hour into our hike, we were walking along the edge of the stream when Paula stopped to take a picture, then asked me to wait for a moment while she texted her friend letting her know that she didn't have enough signal for a call, but could probably push a text through using mine. It was a very familiar dance. The Black Forest is quite close to a village, but thanks to all the hills around us, cell service was quite difficult to find. While she was texting, I wandered a little away from the stream hoping that Paula would be done soon, and just as I was about to turn around, I heard something in the trees behind me. It instantly reminded me of that feeling of being followed, but this time I really made an effort to find out if something or someone was following us. I started walking directly towards the spot where I heard the noise, shouting and asking if anyone was there, and that's exactly when I saw him. This big guy dressed like a hiker, but he was wearing thick, heavy gloves, almost like those assault gloves you see with hard knuckles. While covering your face in this way might be acceptable nowadays, it definitely wasn't normal back in 2015, especially since the guy had no orange markings on his clothing for hunting, or, more importantly, he had no gun in sight. There are 1 or 2 cabins there, but they don't care if you park there as long as you don't leave trash behind, and the place is so remote that there's hardly anyone there to care. But when I arrived late Friday afternoon, there was another car parked there with a girl leaning on it. She was cute, dressed in hiking clothes, but she looked annoyed, not really angry or anything, but very upset about something. I parked a little distance away from her. I didn't want to crowd her or provoke any trouble, and then got out of my car and started getting my equipment out of the trunk. I didn't want to be a creep and start an unwanted conversation or anything like that, so I resigned myself and planned to walk past her and do my own thing. But as I started walking, we made a brief, awkward eye contact and started talking. We exchanged greetings, and I asked her if everything was okay, and she responded that it wasn't, and that was it. It turns out that a friend had canceled on a hike that she'd been looking forward to, and she didn't feel like driving all the way back home for nothing. She was considering going on the hiking trail by herself, but she also wanted to see if she could still convince her friend to come anyway, since she was very aware that it wasn't the wisest idea for a woman to go hiking alone. I felt relieved not to see a weapon in his hands, but the fact that he was covering his face clearly meant that he was up to something nefarious. And then there was the fact that he simply didn't answer when I finally asked if everything was okay. He just gave me a death stare for a moment, and then turned back around and walked into the woods. Now my mind was racing like crazy, and I thought following his paces on a single hiking trail was one thing, but this guy had followed our tracks through a clearing and then simply remained on our track, even though we were seemingly randomly changing direction. I like to think I'm a bit of an outdoorsman, but to me, those were precise tracking skills, and if this guy was using his skills for something evil, it was going to be a big problem for us. I went back to Paula, told her exactly what I saw, and told her that we needed to get out of there quickly. I told her I knew it sounded crazy, and I fully understand why she might think I was an idiot or something like that. But I'd rather she think I was an idiot and be alive than to do nothing and get both of us into danger. So many terrible things seem to happen because people don't stop and just tell themselves that this isn't normal or safe and that they need to leave, and I was just having one of those moments. I made my little speech at machine gun pace, and honestly, for a moment, I thought I had convinced her, but when I was finished and started to walk, gesturing for her to follow, she just stood there. I remember saying, "We need to go, Paula, now," but instead of following me, she verbally slapped me across the face. She told me that I was acting like a complete idiot, and that if someone was following us, she would have noticed something. She wasn't a helpless girl either, so it annoyed me how I was acting, and in her opinion, just because someone was on our trail didn't mean that they were acting intentionally. These were all good points, and at another time I probably would have retorted, but I knew that this was no other time. There was something clearly ominous about this strange guy, and we needed to take reasonable precautions immediately. And then I started to notice this gradual shift in the way Paula was speaking to me. She went from something like, "Come on, man, you're being ridiculous," and was urging me to stay, to accusing me of being a mixture of a fool, a coward, and mentally unstable. I wanted to get her back to her car. She wanted to stay put, not even move to a more remote spot along the stream, and if I wanted to move or leave her, then I wasn't even half the man I thought I was among other personal attacks from her. I remember how confused I was beyond belief. Honestly, it seemed like any girl in their right mind would at least be a little alarmed if they were being followed by a man in a mask, but here was Paula, not even slightly bothered by the sight of me being visibly upset while I was warning her about a potential danger. The only mitigating circumstance, I suppose, was the idea that she thought I was trying to trick her to go somewhere more secluded. I don't know. So I could be an undiscovered serial killer. I fully understood that, and I assumed that her reluctance was from that and not from her being dumb, naive, or enough not to react to my warnings. We were both pretty loud by this point, arguing back and forth, and I realized that our noise was going to make it very easy for someone to pinpoint us and catch us off guard. I remember just looking around to make sure that we were still alone, and I felt this chill go down my spine when I realized that we were, in fact, alone in the woods, at least as far as the eye could see. But that didn't diminish the sense of danger that I felt. I knew we needed to move, but Paula was determined to stay there. I tried reasoning with her, explaining that it wasn't about me trying to trick her, but about keeping us safe, but every time I tried to speak, she just raised her voice and accused me of things that just weren't true. Finally, I decided that I couldn't make her leave with me. If she wanted to stay there, she had the right to, but I couldn't stay and jeopardize my own safety. I told her that I was going to go get help and that I'd be back as soon as possible. She nodded, visibly annoyed, but didn't say anything. I started walking as fast as I could, trying not to make any noise and listening out for any noise that might indicate the presence of the mysterious man who was following us. I was nervous and worried, but also determined to find help as quickly as possible. After walking for a while, I finally found a strong cell signal to make a call. I dialed the emergency number and explained the situation as best as I could. I provided the approximate location and asked for help to be sent as quickly as possible. After hanging up, I felt a little relieved, but I was still worried about Paula. I was hoping that she was okay and that help would arrive in time. I continued walking towards the location where we had parked the car, keeping my eyes and ears open for any sign of danger. I was impatient to get to the car and drive back to the parking lot as soon as possible, where I hoped to find the rescue services. Finally, I reached the car and got in quickly. I started the engine and drove back to the parking lot as fast as I could. When I arrived, I saw several emergency vehicles parked there. I approached them and explained the situation to the rescue workers, who immediately set off to look for Paula. I sat in the car, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. I was worried about Paula, but also relieved that help was on the way. I could only hope and pray that everything would be okay. We started a little hiking trip in southern Europe, specifically the Johann Müller State Forest. We looked at some options for renting cabins and found one that was within our budget, then reserved it for a weekend. It was a beautiful place, not far from a heart-shaped lake and with easy access to all the different hiking trails in the park. Our first day was wonderful. We had a picnic near the Emerald Lake, followed by a campfire dinner at our cabin. The day was nice, but the night was intimidating, to say the least. There were a lot of cabins scattered throughout the forest, so we weren't in a particularly secluded spot, but the night in the forest is very different than the night in the city, especially if you've spent most of your life in the latter. There's something very unsettling about it, and both my partner and I independently commented on it. We weren't frightened at all. We felt very safe there, so the feeling was something new, I suppose, and not something that kept us from sleeping. The second day was similar to the first. We did some hiking, had another outdoor lunch, and then returned to the cabin in time for dinner. But instead of eating at the cabin, we went to the waterfalls south of the town for a fancy 3-course meal and a bottle of wine. We discussed whether to take a taxi to and from the waterfalls, but I decided that I wanted to be fresh the next morning, so I drove, and my partner drank the wine, a little too well, however. By the time we got back to the cabin, she was so drunk that she was out the moment her head hit the pillow. I didn't blame her for taking the opportunity to let loose like that. I thought it was funny, but it turned out to be very fortunate that only one of us was in good shape that night, and I'll tell you why. After my partner had fallen asleep and was snoring very loudly, I must add, I brushed my teeth, took a shower, and then got into bed. It was just before midnight at this point, and I set my alarm for 7:30 a.m. I don't know how long it took until I realized that my phone was vibrating on the rustic little wooden table next to my head. I reached for it only to realize that it wasn't my phone making the noise, but something else entirely, something that was gently scratching against the wood on the other side of the cabin wall, almost exactly next to where I'd laid my head. Now, while that was very eerie for a second or two, I'm rational enough to realize that a noise like that probably came from some kind of animal, and after doing a little research, I knew that we only had to worry about snakes and possibly foxes or coyotes. There tended not to be any bears or jaguars in this part of Europe, or rather the chances of encountering the former are extremely low. That was the reason why we chose the state forest, knowing that it was one of the safest options for hiking. So as I said, the noise was surprising, but not at first. I tried to go back to sleep, hoping that whatever was making that noise would get bored and walk away. I know that a lot of animals will scratch their claws or teeth against the wood to grind them or sharpen them, so I thought, maybe it's just something small and harmless doing just that. But then the scratching started to move, and it sounded like it was coming from a different section of the wall, much higher than before. I say much higher. It was maybe only a foot or two higher, but in my mind, whatever was making that noise went from the size of a squirrel to the size of a fox. That was also quite alarming, and I picked my head up off the pillow again, while I wondered if I should do anything. In the end, I got out of bed, went over to where I could hear the scratching, and then banged on the wall a couple of times to try and scare it away. It seemed to work, actually, and the sound of my fist against the wall didn't wake my partner, so I just went back to bed without saying a word. I swear, I was just about to fall back asleep when the scratching started again. I realized that if I wanted to get a half-decent night, I was going to have to go outside with my flashlight and really scare this thing off. So I got out of bed, threw on some clothes, and then went out into the darkness with my flashlight. I could hear whatever was scratching against the wood, but I wasn't afraid at all because I thought that it would just jump away as soon as it saw the beam from my flashlight or heard my footsteps. And that's exactly what it did too, and I heard it running away into the darkness just before it went around the corner. But instead of hearing the familiar patter of four-legged animals like a fox or a coyote, I heard the very distinct sound of something running on two legs, not four. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, and I swear to God that realization made the moment the most frightening of my entire life. I'd spent all this time thinking it was all okay, but there was some freak scratching something against the wood the whole time, and I really tried to go back to sleep. I ran back into the cabin, grabbed the biggest, heaviest thing I could find, a frying pan, and then ran back outside. I wanted to shout something brave and tough, but the truth is that I was almost dying of fright. I could barely form a coherent thought, let alone shout something intimidating, so I just ran around, spun in circles, and pointed the flashlight at every little shadow to make sure that no one had snuck up on me. Once I was pretty sure that the coast was genuinely clear, I ran back to the cabin, locked the front door, and then woke up my partner. She was still half drunk, but she sobered up pretty quickly when I told her to get her phone ready in case she needed to dial the emergency number. I still don't know if it was just a silly prank or whether some kids were vandalizing the cabins or trying to intentionally frighten us, but it all hinged on what they were scratching on the wall. That much was clear. But I was in no mood to just go back out into the darkness and have a look immediately. We just stayed sitting there in silence for a couple of minutes with my hand on the frying pan handle, listening for any voices, footsteps, or scratching. After a few minutes of silence, I finally went back out into the darkness for 2 reasons. First, to make sure that we were really alone again, and second, to see what the hell this weird person had been doing on the outside wall of the cabin. I was scared, but I was also ready to bash the skull of anyone who dared to attack me like that. Fortunately, I didn't have to defend myself, but there was nothing reassuring about what I found on the cabin wall. When I first saw it, it looked like someone had tried to write an O or the number 0 underneath a roughly scratched U or V. The result was that it almost looked like someone had tried to write VL but vertically instead of horizontally. I didn't instantly put words to it. I mean, if it was an O and then an I, maybe they were trying to write the word kill, then we should be worried, but the V and the O, I had no idea what it might mean. Convinced that it was just kids being silly vandals, I told my partner that I was safe outside and that she could come out and see what the kids had scratched on the wall. She seemed relieved to know that it wasn't anything too sinister, and that we'd probably be left alone for the rest of our stay. In fact, all we were worried about for a minute or two was whether the owners would dip into our security deposit when they discovered the damage. After my partner got dressed, we both went outside to check the damage. I pointed my flashlight at it, showed her the strange V and O shapes, and saw a very visible expression of fear on her face. I asked her what she thought it was, and she asked how I couldn't see it. To me, they were just strange shapes or letters. To her, it was literally the devil. To be honest, I didn't really see it at first, and thought it was just her nerves talking, but her fear proved contagious, and when she decided that she wasn't going to stay another night in the cabin, I wasn't in a position to stop her. I remember her saying that this was setting off all the alarm bells. We'd be stupid to stay now, and honestly, she was right. It really didn't matter who it was, or why they'd scratched something on the wall of our cabin. Our car was outside, and they could literally see that the cabin was occupied, and who the hell sneaks around in the woods in the middle of the night like that? Nobody with anything good in mind, that's for sure. We packed our things, threw everything in the car, and drove off as fast as we could. First, my partner called the police to report what had happened, and then left a message with the cabin owner explaining the situation. They were nice enough to refund us the last night of our stay and fully returned our security deposit, which disproved our strange conspiracy theory that the owners were trying to keep our deposit. We still have no idea who or what happened that night, and honestly, I'm open to the possibility that we just overreacted because someone played a silly prank or something like that. But still, I don't regret cutting our little vacation short because my partner is right. We've seen enough horror movies to know that you don't stay when things start getting weird. It seemed like a fair deal, so I agreed. The next day I asked the same young man if I could sit with him, and he said yes, but only if I gave him my dessert. While that seemed fair to me, I still agreed, and then we ate in silence. I didn't touch my dessert, and assumed that this young man would take it when he was done, but when he finished his dessert, I offered mine to him, and he suddenly changed his mind. He shook his head, pushed a little bowl towards me, and we've been friends ever since. Edward, as I called him, was my best friend throughout my entire elementary school education, and we ended up going to the same high school too. I drank my first soda with him. Our first girlfriends were best friends, and he was at almost every major event in my adolescence in one way or another. Eventually, we separated when we went to different universities, but we stayed in touch, and he returned home after graduating for work here. He was there for me during all of my breakups, helped me move into my first proper apartment, and was the best man at his wedding, and the list goes on. I was there for all the highs and lows when Laura and he bought a house, had a baby, and all those other adult things, and I was the first person to whom Eduardo told about the accident. It was the beginning of April when he called me at around 2 a.m. I knew something was up because the call came so late, but I never could have guessed how horrible the news was. Laura was just bringing their daughter home from playgroup when two thieves ran them over on a crosswalk. Their daughter was declared dead while Laura was in a hospital bed fighting for her life, and within a few hours, Eduardo's whole world was destroyed by two monsters in a car. He was devastated as you can imagine. He called in sick from work, was prescribed antidepressants, and then moved in with his parents because he simply couldn't look after himself. We all helped him out by looking out for him, making sure he kept off the alcohol and all that, but that was practically all we could do. Losing your wife and daughter in that way so suddenly is something you have to deal with on your own, you know, and for a long time Eduardo seemed like he honestly couldn't, and I couldn't blame him. But then one day I received a surprising text message from him that simply said, "Are you ready for a trip?" To explain, going on a trip was what we called our hiking and camping trips that we used to go on when we were younger. I guess we always imagined ourselves as explorers, but seeing as we would never pass the drug test we made do with these epic trips into the wilderness, sometimes for a week at a time. We would camp at different spots each night and return home with no shower smelling of campfire smoke while we would tell each other ghost stories at night. It was lots of fun. We managed about 5 or 6 big and little trips before jobs and girlfriends started to take up all of our time, but as much as I looked forward to the day when we could go again, I did think that it might be a little too early. After discussing it, we agreed on the second week of April, almost a year after the accident. I tried to tell myself that the timing was just a coincidence, but at the same time, I fully understood if he wanted to get away for a few days, especially around the anniversary, and there was always something quite soothing about our trips. If you run out of food and water and are exposed to the elements, you don't have time to worry about the problems you have in the real world. I didn't know how much that would affect the terrible grief, but in the short term, it seemed to work since Eduardo seemed much more animated if he had something to focus his mind on. I was ordering camping equipment online, testing it out in his mother's garden, and with all the planning we had to do, he was also much more talkative. It was like the old days in many ways, but with one notable difference. Apart from the obvious things, Eduardo had suggested a place for us to visit. Anyone reading this might say, yeah, so what? I never made any of the decisions when it came to our hiking and camping trips. After he planned the first few, he left it all up to me so he could concentrate on the equipment and getting us there. So when he said he wanted to visit Canyon du Verdon, and specifically a place called Moustier Sainte-Marie, it was a refreshing change, if I'm honest. We'd never been to Provence before, so I was very excited about that, but Edouard's winding trail would take us through many freshwater rivers, hikes over hills, and a big breakfast at the end, which sounded absolutely terrific. The longest we'd ever hiked was for a week, and seeing as we were just starting up again, I wasn't surprised when he said that he only wanted to go for 2 days. I was just happy that he seemed to be back to his old self, but if I'd have known what he was really planning, I don't think I would have ever gone with him. Everything seemed to be going well on the trip to Moustier Sainte-Marie. In fact, it was just like the old days. We took turns driving and played old playlists, and overall enjoyed a bit of nostalgia to pass the time on the journey. The parking was easy and cheap, and on top of that, we had unexpectedly good weather for April, which got our epic hiking trip off to a good start. Given his first experience, Edouard did an excellent job planning the route and guided us through some breathtaking scenery. We hiked about 8 or 9 kilometers gently downhill and then along a narrow river until we came to a small lake. The path down was very steep, and the river fell into a waterfall that fed the larger lake. It was a spectacular setting, and I knew instantly that it would be our first campsite. We found a nice flat spot about 50 meters from the bank and pitched our small A-frame shelters opposite each other. Once we were ready, we made some tea on our gas burners and then set about collecting wood for the night. We were quiet while we worked, and I put that down to the fact we were both concentrating on finding good firewood. But then Eduardo didn't seem to perk up again. I noticed in the middle of preparing my dinner that he wasn't going to join me, but he said he wasn't hungry and would eat later if he felt like it. But later came and he still didn't seem to want to eat. We stayed up quite late, and all we did was sit by the fire and exchange stories, but I didn't see a scrap of food pass his lips. As I laid down in my shelter, Edward said that he was going to stay up for a while to watch the stars. That didn't raise any alarm bells with me, but what did was when I woke up 6 or 7 hours later and he was still sat by the fire, not sat by the fire drinking a cup of tea, with tousled hair, and obviously had a couple of hours sleep. The exact same position with his tent seemingly intact, like he hadn't moved for hours. The first words that came to mind as I stepped out of my shelter were, "Didn't you sleep?" He didn't need to answer me. The dark circles under his eyes said everything, and that was when I started to realize that maybe it wasn't a good idea to agree to this camping trip. I asked him if he was okay, and had to giggle a little when he said, "A little tired." I asked again if he was really okay before telling him there was no shame in giving up and going home if he was really unwell. That was a complete lie, but it worked, and that's when he partly told me what he was planning. There was no hiking, no river journey for a couple of days before a big breakfast in Moustier-Sainte-Marie. He and I, as he put it, needed to do something for Laura and the baby, and that meant not eating or sleeping. Drinking water was okay, but only if he was really thirsty, and then after he'd gone 3 days without food and sleep, he was going to walk to the waterfall. You remember the waterfall I talked about, the one we could see from our campsite? Well, Eduardo said that there was a small rocky cave behind it. It wasn't anything big, just big enough for one person to sit down without getting wet, and when I asked him how he knew that, he said that he had checked it out overnight. Everything was just as he said it was, and when I asked him what it was for, Eduardo said that he was too tired to explain. The only reason he partially explained what he was planning was because he needed me there and believed that if he didn't tell me, he might actually leave. He knew how it looked. A guy starving himself because he was tired of living, or something like that, but he assured me that wasn't the case. He needed me there to help him back to the car when he was finished, because he'd probably be too weak to do it on his own. I remember sitting there by the fire for a minute or two, speechless, trying to understand what Eduardo was telling me. When I finally collected my thoughts, I asked him why he had to go to this little cave after 3 days without food and sleep. I'd help him, of course, I just needed to know why. Again, he just said something like, "It's for Laura and the baby," and if I'm honest, that was as good an explanation as I needed. I had no idea what he was trying to do, but I knew that it would be difficult, and probably dangerous as well. But what else can you do when a friend asks you to do something like that and tells you that he can't trust anyone else to do it? There was no way to stop him from going there. Just letting him go was not an option, and as much as calling the emergency services seemed like the best option, it felt like a betrayal. Imagine someone putting so much trust in you and you just turn it down and let them get arrested. I know that's the emotional, not rational response, but in that moment, it just didn't feel right. There seemed to be no other option but to do what he asked, to make sure that no matter what happened, he would come out okay on the other side. It turned out that the first day of his fast was actually the day before we left. The second day was the walk to the waterfall. Eduardo seemed a little exhausted on the walk, but I put that down to old age and a bad night's sleep or something like that. So this second day we were in Moustier-Sainte-Marie was the third and final day without food or sleep, which meant that his whole plan was going to end in the early hours of the morning. It all sounded okay when I heard that, but I was still worried about seeing him in such bad shape. It was the lack of sleep that was really wearing him down. I could see his brain slowly breaking down after such a long time without fuel, and when he went to the toilet, his urine was brown, not that dark yellow, unhealthy color you see after a summer night in a beer garden. It was a sick brown color, like rum or whiskey or something. I know it sounds a bit weird to focus on his urine like that, but things like that are pretty shocking if you've never seen it before. And it wasn't just his body, it was his mind, too. He started repeating things, stumbling over his words, and then going back to an earlier point in a conversation as if no 10 or 20 minutes had passed. As the sun went down, he was ready for it all to end, but we had a lot to do before then. I didn't sleep a second that night, but I wasn't sure whether Eduardo wasn't going to try and harm himself either. I simply had to trust that he wouldn't. I questioned him more and more as the night went on, but he was less and less inclined to chat. Still, he told me that he had been thinking about this night for months and had gone through it so many times that he was bored of thinking about it, let alone talking about it. He told me that he understood how annoying that must be, but he'd tell me everything when he was finished, but until then, I'd have to wait. Finally, the time came. I walked him back to the waterfall, and he started undressing. I suppose this was always the plan. He didn't want his only jacket and pair of boots to get wet, but it was freezing, and he was shivering like a dog as he handed me the last of his clothes. Over the noise of the waterfall, I heard him thank me one last time before turning and disappearing into the water. It was exactly 27 minutes when I thought I heard something over the roar of the waterfall. I remember cupping my ear and thinking my ears were playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. It was barely audible over the rush of the waterfall, but it sounded very much like a person, and then suddenly Eduardo was there. He was as pale as a sheet, as thin as a stick, and shivering violently. And then there were the noises he was making, and damn, they were eerie. Not quite crying, not quite screaming, all muffled from 3 days without food or sleep. As soon as he reached the bank of the stream, he just collapsed, and I threw his jacket around him. He couldn't talk, he could barely move, and I did my best to drag him back to the fire and leave him there to warm up properly. I asked him if he could eat anything, and he nodded very weakly, so I threw a couple of granola bars and a bottle of water at his feet. I had to feed him and put the bottle to his lips so that he could eat properly. Eduardo ate slowly while silent tears ran down his cheeks, and I shed a few too. As soon as he had eaten a little more and drunk some water, Eduardo asked me to help him into his tent so that he could finally sleep. I made sure he stayed dry, helped him put on a few layers, and then tucked him in his sleeping bag. I think he was asleep before I'd finished wrapping him up, and all I wanted to do was curl up in my own sleeping bag to rest, but when it came to it, I couldn't. I was caught between being too tired to stay awake and too anxious to fall asleep, but the more I fought it, the easier it became. I don't know exactly what time it was at this point, but I remember seeing a little blue light on the distant horizon. I closed my eyes for a second, and then the next thing I knew, it was full day. My eyes were burning and I felt sick from exhaustion, but when I saw that Eduardo was still there, breathing and sleeping, I knew that everything was going to be okay. I tried to sleep for a couple more hours, but an overactive brain fueled by a nap made that impossible. I wanted to wake him up, get him to eat a little more and have a coffee, but that was for selfish reasons. What I really wanted to know was what had happened behind the waterfall, why he had put himself through such an ordeal. But God knows, I needed the sleep, and there'd be plenty of time to ask questions on the way back. I think this piece is long enough to summarize this conversation as well as I possibly can. After safely getting Eduardo back to Mustia Sainte Marie, we bought some more food. I bought Eduardo one of those big bottles of coconut water so that he could stay hydrated on the way back, and then we started our trip home. He didn't tell me much about what happened or why he did it. He said that he was still processing it himself, but basically, this was it. He had read something online about this waterfall, something about ancient shamans going there for spiritual experiences. The story said that if you focused intensely on someone who had already passed away, you could feel their presence, receive their guidance or connection, or something along those lines. The only rule was that you had to sit there for 3 days with nothing but coconut water in front of you to drink. Obviously, Eduardo tried to streamline the process for safety and comfort, and thought that as long as he drank a little water, he could last the whole fast and stay awake, far away from the waterfall itself. He was quite worried that he had ruined the process and therefore ruined the intended effect, but he hadn't, according to Eduardo. The process worked just as planned. I feel obliged to explain that I'm not a very spiritual person and don't believe in paranormal or spiritual experiences. I believe that Eduardo pushed his physical and mental limits and conjured up some kind of trance or altered state of consciousness, and deep down, I think he knows that too. The thing is, he doesn't care, and I can't really blame him for that either. And as much as I pretend not to know how it worked, I understand why he wanted to do it. The chance to feel the presence or connection with a deceased loved one, even if it's not real, I admit that I see the appeal. Anyone who's experienced something as tragic as losing his wife and child deserves some kind of comfort, even if that comfort is self-induced, and if that means doing something as extreme as what he did, then so be it. At the end of the day, Eduardo harmed nobody else. He was just dealing with his own pain in the best way he knew how, and if that meant doing something as extreme as what he did, then so be it. So, there it is, the story of our trip to the mountains of Europe. It wasn't the typical camping and hiking adventure we expected, but it was an experience that we'll never forget, and although Eduardo hasn't told me all the details about what happened behind that waterfall, I respect his privacy enough not to push him. Whatever he experienced there will leave between him and his deceased loved ones. The important thing is that Eduardo is doing much better after all of this, and that's all that really matters. I then wished him good luck and continued on. I don't think I even made it 4 or 5 steps before I heard him calling out again, but this time he said something so bizarre that it actually made me chuckle quietly. The guy says in a way that made it sound as if there had been a little mix-up, "Hey, do you think that's my backpack?" I stopped, smiled at how ridiculous his claim was, and then turned around and told him with a hint of laughter that he must be mistaken. He started walking towards me slowly and calmly, saying, "No, it's totally my backpack. I've been looking for it all afternoon. I'm a 31-year-old woman from Osaka, and was 28 years old when this story happened. During the time of the Herch Me Too movement, I remember talking to a friend about the topic of not all men. We both agreed that it was ridiculous to label all men as predators, but we disagreed on something more subtle. My friend believed that it made sense to be cautious around any man outside of the immediate family, since practically any person, no matter how friendly or nice they seemed, could be a predator. I thought that was a rather pessimistic view, and that it made sense to be cautious on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't dial the first 2 digits of the emergency number on my phone if an Uber driver asked me how my day had been, but I would bring my pepper spray if I was going down a dark street. We discussed it for a while we had a couple of drinks, and although they were always friendly exchanges, we never came to a fixed conclusion. However, my friend said something that really struck me. Not all men, but one is enough. I had no idea how right she was. You see, a few months later, I drove to Valle de Bravo in my hometown of Achaca, parked my car in the old parking lot by the dam, and then made my way from my favorite pillar towards the surrounding mountains. Anyway, I went up almost to the beginning of the hiking trails, took my photos, and then began the descent into the village, taking photos along the way. Halfway down, I reached a fork in the path leading to the left, and when I looked, I saw someone standing there on the path. He immediately stood out because he wasn't wearing any hiking gear, and I'd never seen anyone that far up the path who wasn't wearing mountain or hiking gear. He had long hair, sneakers, wide shorts, and a t-shirt, an average white skater type, maybe 20 to 24 years old, I'd guess. That alone wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary, but this guy didn't have a backpack or water bottle. He just seemed lost. We looked at each other for a moment, and I smiled politely before continuing on my way. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I simply took my backpack off my shoulders and then showed it, saying, "I can promise you this one is mine. It even has my name." And I showed him the tag that said Maddie. He leaned forward and squinted, as if the writing was tiny and not written in big letters, and then asked me with a voice that sounded really hurt, "Why would you do that?" I literally remember the Kittelel to Auto jingle going off in my head. This guy was playing a silly prank on me with his friend filming behind a tree, or he was genuinely crazy and I didn't want to stay to find out what was true. I cranked my politeness up to 100, smiled, and told him that I unfortunately had to go. "I hope you find your backpack okay." He remained silent as I turned and started to walk away, and I found myself waiting for that to be the end of the encounter, but as I realized, that was more of an optimistic thought than an accurate assessment. The distance from where I encountered the guy to the end of the path was perhaps only a mile, so after a few minutes of walking, I could literally see people walking near the houses at the end of the path. And just seeing them was a huge relief. I almost felt like I was back in friendly territory. You know, even if the guy was an idiot, he wouldn't dare do anything to me if other people were nearby. But what was even better, all of a sudden I see these 2 hikers coming up the path towards us. I thought, instead of taking the risk of this guy following me back to my car, I would ask these hikers to accompany me. But as we got closer, the guy who was following me tried one last trick. As soon as I called out to the 2 hikers, he began screaming over me, saying things like, "Help me, my sister offered me an antidote and wants to kill herself. You have to help me catch her." I remember turning around in that moment full of anger, wondering if I had accidentally stumbled upon the biggest psychopath on the planet. And then, as I turned back around to say something about that, I heard those quick, heavy footsteps coming towards me. I remember turning around and seeing the guy running towards me, and at the last second I released a charge of pepper spray before he hit me. Thank God most, if not all, of the spray was effective despite his attempts to shield his face. When I regained my composure, I was shaken up but still angry, and it was incredibly satisfying to see him rubbing his eyes and screaming in pain. When I heard his steps following me on the path, I started to get nervous. This wasn't an unusual meeting with a strange stranger anymore. Instead, the strange stranger was now following me on a quiet mountain slope path with no other soul in sight. Remember what I said about pepper spray and dark streets? That rule also applied to mountain paths, and I always carry one of those cute mini pepper sprays on my car keys. In a smooth motion, I took my backpack off my shoulders again, put my hand into the small pocket where I kept the car keys, and stuck them into the pocket for easier access, and once they were there, I felt a little more comfortable speaking again. I asked the guy if he was following me, and he said yes because I had his backpack. I told him that it wasn't a funny joke and that it wasn't even funny the first time, and he told me that it wasn't a joke, that he wanted me to give him his backpack back, and that if I didn't, he would have to take it by force. We kept walking, me with my back to him and him about 5 meters behind me. I told the guy that it sounded like he was threatening me. When he heard that, he adopted an indignant tone and asked me how I dared to play the victim when I was the one who had stolen his backpack. I was so convinced that it was a joke that I actually stopped, turned around, and tried to find the equally dumb skater guy with a smartphone. In retrospect, I think that was just a hopeful thought. If someone else had been there, I wouldn't have been dealing with another crazy person. But when I realized that we were really alone on the path, it wasn't a pleasant feeling, I can tell you that. The hikers had rushed to the scene as I got up, and I explained everything very clearly, that the idiot wasn't my brother and he had been harassing me the whole way on the path. They told me very kindly that they would keep him there until I was out of sight, and as I walked away, I took out my phone and called the police. I was almost at the end of the path when I heard the shout, "You can't tell me shit from a distance," and just as I turned around, the 2 hikers were wrestling with this guy on the ground. I kept walking while I gave all of this information to the emergency services and was incredibly grateful that these 2 hikers had turned up when they did. Even when I thought I was safe, I now know in retrospect that I wasn't. People have been kidnapped in the middle of the day, and there's no saying what would have happened if he had continued following me. What I find incredibly creepy to this day is how refined he tried to be, and how he seemed to enjoy mentally torturing me instead of physically. Although I have a feeling that the mental was just a prelude to something that never had a chance to develop. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely psychotic or just mentally ill, so when I realized that this guy was either crazy or trying to insist on me in the strangest way, I reached for my pepper spray. I pulled it out, showed it to him, and he again pulled out this card of frustration. I told him that I would spray him if he didn't leave me alone, and then I would call the police. He responded, saying things like, "Go ahead, call the police. That's my backpack you're carrying," with my stuff in it. I told him again that I would spray him if he came within 5 feet of me, and then I turned around and was immediately confronted with the problem that I was facing. If I really wanted to be safe, I would have to walk the damn rest of the way back to Valle de Bravo. The best I could do was maintain a safe minimum distance and keep my hand on the pepper spray. This guy followed me for a long way, screaming at me as we went down the mountain, and the more he spoke, the ruder he became. Perhaps I mentioned in the beginning that he behaved politely and was well-mannered. Then he switched to a tone of victimhood, which he had adopted, but over time he became increasingly rude. I remember at one point he said something like, "I don't understand why you're such a... Just admit you're wrong and give me my stuff back," and then he became more aggressive. He started saying things like, "You need therapy. You could do hours of therapy sessions and not sort out all the damn mess in your head." He really said that. My blood was boiling, but I knew that it was better not to react. If anything, I just wanted to stop him so that he could get closer again, or he just wanted that strange attention, which I wasn't going to give him. Apart from occasionally looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't trying to get closer, I tried not to give the guy a single word. Born December 19, 1986, Christina Kalika grew up in Canada as the only daughter of divorced Filipino migrants, Elizabeth and Mario Kalika. Like many Filipinos, she had a strict Catholic upbringing and was described as hard-working and a natural leader with the goal of attending the Teachers' College at York University in Toronto. At 5'2" and 125 pounds, she stayed in shape through volleyball and occasionally sought out jogging before the civic holiday in 2007. Christina had planned to attend a Christian youth conference in the city of Montreal, but pulled out at the last minute in favor of a hike to Rainbow Falls Provincial Park in Ontario. There she was accompanied by her 20-year-old cousin, Faith Costello, and two friends, Eddie Maiga and Joe Benedict. The Rainbow Falls Provincial Park covers an area of about 2 square miles and is located on the highway between the towns of Schreiber and Rossport. There are 2 main campgrounds within its borders. The main campground on White Sand Lake, which is only a few hundred meters from the park entrance, and the smaller campground in Roseport, which is 3 kilometers west of the Trans-Canada Highway. Most of the trails in the park are relatively easy and range in length from 3 to 5 kilometers, the only exception being the Cascais Trail, which is 32 miles long and runs through the park from Rossport to Terrace Bay. Leaving the trails and heading to Rainbow Falls takes one into what some have described as some of the roughest terrain in the province. On Sunday, August 5, 2007, Christina and her friends arrived at the park at around 12 noon. Christina had driven for 14 hours from Toronto, and having completed a 2-day trip, the group was exhausted. They set up camp at Lot 88 of the campsite at White Sand Lake and exchanged a few friendly greetings with their new, but temporary, neighbors. Although White Sand Lake was very busy that weekend with only a handful of lots left vacant, Christina and her friends fell asleep due to their exhaustion from the 2-day drive. What was intended to be a half-hour nap turned into a 4-hour snooze. They woke up at around 10:30, started a small campfire, and then ate dinner together while consuming a small amount of alcohol. Almost 100 emergency workers combed the area, including police officers, firefighters, and specially trained divers who searched nearby lakes and beakers. They used GPS devices, underwater radar, infrared cameras, and 4 dogs, as well as 2 motor aircraft, 1 seaplane, 3 helicopters, and a variety of watercraft, but no trace of Christina could be found. Bad weather and rugged terrain made the search extremely difficult, and some search personnel were seriously injured in their work. One man required emergency surgery when a rappelling accident led to horrific facial lesions, while another was taken to hospital with a sprained ankle and a twisted knee after taking a painful fall down a steep slope. An unusual aspect of the search was the use of search dogs that went up and down the Rainbow Falls and Kirkis hiking trails to find Christina's trail. Although they picked up her trail in places where she had walked with Eddie Maiga, there was no trace of her in other places, including near the Rainbow Falls. She had vanished, but her scent trail indicated that she had left the park. At this point, the search for Christina became extremely scientific. The search teams began to study maps of the area in order to identify so-called anthropogenic corridors, which is an elegant term for natural paths that arise off the beaten path, like streams or rivers, even power lines, anything that a person might believe would lead them back to civilization. The search team also based their Phase 2 search areas on a highly developed profile for missing hikers that stated there was a 90% chance that she was still within a 5-mile radius of her last known location. But her condition remained another matter. This strategy led to some interesting developments in the search. A pair of socks was recovered from a deep pool in the Hewitson River, a tributary that flows into the larger White Sand Lake. Search parties also found several footprints in the mossy soil not far from the waterfall, and although the footprints matched Kalika's shoe size, the lack of a recovered profile made it impossible to determine if they were made by one of her running shoes. Contrary to the advice of the provincial police, Christina's family traveled to Rainbow Falls, where they set up a number of tents on the lots rented by friends and well-wishers, and refused to leave until Christina was found. They were supported by Raulesque, a Catholic priest and fellow Filipino-Canadian who held special masses for the family to allay their fears. It also helped to raise the public profile of the case, and within a few days, a team of around 200 volunteers was combing the surrounding area. The team included politicians from the nearby towns of Schreiber and Terrace Bay, but also highly experienced search and rescue personnel who did not just take the opportunity for a photo. August 11th saw a search that lasted 8 full hours and covered the area between the east beach of the provincial park and Highway 17. The next day there was another long search, but this time less than 100 of the original people came out to try again. Frustrated by the lack of results, Christina's family openly admitted that their hope was dwindling. Senior police officers from Ontario assured them that the chances of her survival were high, but her loved ones were obviously prepared for the worst. It was believed that Christina was either kidnapped or murdered, with her mother citing the proximity to the nearby Trans-European Highway as evidence. Elizabeth believed that her gullible daughter might have made a perfect target for a potential murderer, who would then have disappeared almost immediately. Although Christina's 3 friends were accused of having something to do with her disappearance, they vehemently denied any involvement and were not considered suspects. Don MacArthur, a former mayor of Schreiber, believes that no local resident was guilty of her abduction or murder. In his opinion, the only other known murder in the area occurred back in 2005 and was largely linked to the local drug trade. At around 3:30 in the morning, they decided to go back to bed, and everyone was supposed to have fallen asleep within 30 minutes. 3 hours later, Christina woke Eddie up and asked him to accompany her to the communal showers on the campsite. According to Eddie, the two had planned to go jogging together at dawn, and after washing and dressing, they set off on the hiking trails. They jogged together for about 30 minutes. Then at some point, Christina started to get tired. When they reached a crossroads near the park entrance, they decided to part ways. Eddie wanted to continue along the longer of the 2 hiking trails towards Highway 17, while Christina decided to visit the nearby Rainbow Falls waterfall before returning to camp. Eddie only made it as far as a small rest stop on the roadside before he got tired too. He stopped briefly to catch his breath, carved the first of all 4 members' names into a rock, and then made his way back to camp. He stated that he had spent the next few hours looking for an axe to chop up some oversized logs, but could not find one. At around 10:30 a.m., Joe Benedict and Faith Costello emerged from their tents, made breakfast and showered, expecting Christina to return at any moment. When she still hadn't returned by about 11,000 a.m. Joe and Eddie became worried. Joe went down one of the hiking trails towards the waterfall that Christina had intended to visit, and they also searched the Lake Superior Trail and the Rainbow Falls Trail, as well as a number of other hiking trails where she was suspected to have been jogging, but she was nowhere to be found. The 2 men stayed calm and refrained from raising the alarm, believing that Christina would soon be found. However, by the early afternoon, she still hadn't appeared. At around 2:00 am, the group contacted a park ranger to report Christina as missing. The park rangers then joined the group of friends and continued their search on the nearby hiking trails and beaches. When it became clear that she was missing, they advised them to report her disappearance to the police. The Regional Emergency Response Team of the Ontario Police took over the search and quickly set up a command post near White Sand Island. One of the most likely theories was put forward by the moderator of the CBC podcast, The Next Call with David Ron. He suggested that convicted child molester Dennis Levy may have been involved in Christina's disappearance, given his history of abusing teenage girls. Moreover, her disappearance fit within the period when Leigh was actively praying. Ridden theorized that Christina, after her run, took off her socks to wait in the waters of the Hivitson River, where she was attacked by her murderer. He rejected the idea that the socks recovered from the river might not have belonged to Christina, and said that they only appeared larger due to their long time in the water. Renz's theories, although seemingly well thought out, were completely rejected by the Ontario Provincial Police, who do not believe that Christina was deliberately or maliciously killed. In fact, one or two detectives even raised the idea that Christina might have intentionally disappeared in order to sever ties with her community and her family. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that a member of the strict religious community had a sudden change of heart, and instead of facing the anger and shame of their loved ones, they instead vanished themselves. However, there is strong evidence that Christina had a wonderful relationship with her parents and continued to share their deep Christian faith. She was steadfast in her participation in certain Christian youth organizations and even decided to go camping with friends she had met at one of these conferences for a weekend after pulling out of her last conference. Even if the possibility cannot be completely ruled out, since people have hidden worse secrets from their families, but in this case it is clear that what happened to Christina did not happen of her own accord. Other search and rescue personnel have questioned the effectiveness of the entire search effort. One volunteer claimed that entire sections of the forest were so dense that if a person became incapacitated, they would remain upright due to the mass of surrounding vegetation. This could hide the body from other aerial search teams that covered most of the terrain during the search. Ontario police officer Greg Beasley also spoke of such difficulties, telling a journalist that, when you stumble, you don't fall. Perhaps the investigation came closest to the real reason for Christina's disappearance when, in March 2009, a volunteer from the non-profit search and rescue organization from Minnesota claimed that the volunteer bodies had found Christina's remains in November 2009. During this privately funded search, 6 cadaver dogs indicated human remains at a location on the Hewitson River, but further investigations were impossible due to the speed and depth of the water. Hussey believes that if the private search and rescue teams had had access to more advanced equipment, their task could possibly have been completed then and there. Perhaps the remains of Christina Kalika lie deep beneath the waters of Rainbow Falls, but just as many other clues in this case have proven to be a dead end. The reason why she was never found in the park might be that she is no longer there. As one police officer pointed out, the lack of remains may be the best indicator that Christina was kidnapped. This raises the question, did the predator who took her receive another form of indirect justice, or are they still walking among us?